Welcome to Amp Life, the official podcast of Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm the Brian Moe, the social media advisor for Delatour, and I also happen to be a below-knee amputee. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome, everyone, to a very special edition of Amp Life. In this episode, the hosts of the Nobody's podcast, Will, Eric, and Nick, sit down with Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics President Ed Delatour, Director of Prosthetics Drew Buffett, and social media advisor and below-knee amputee me, the Brian Moe, as we discuss walking again post-amputation. For more information about the Nobody's podcast, please visit their website, www.twonobodies.com. That's TWOKNOWBODIES.com, or check them out on Facebook and Twitter at Two Nobodies. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Nobody's Talking podcast. I'm incredibly excited. I'm here with Nick and Eric, and sitting across from me are Ed Delatour, Drew and Brian, employees of Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and it's an honor to be sitting with you all. Guys, welcome to this episode. It's so great to have you on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And we wanted to start out, Ed, if you don't mind, just if you're willing to share a little bit of the history of Delatour.
Sure. Well, our company was started in 1962 by my father, Manuel Delatour, and my mother worked in the business as well. But my father was an orthotist. He came to Pittsburgh actually back in the late 50s to help start the Harmarville Rehabilitation Hospital, which frankly no longer exists under that name, but it was a brand new rehab hospital that was under construction. And my parents were living in New York City. My father learned about the hospital, was looking for a brace maker, which is, of course, what they were called back in the 50s.
Yeah.
And long story short, he applied and got the job. And so my parents moved from New York here to Pittsburgh, living in the northern suburbs, and my dad helped start the brace shop at Harmarville.
Wow.
After a few years of that, he decided he didn't like working within a hospital situation, so after a few moves, he ended up independently starting Delatour Orthopedic Appliances in 1962, and that's the business that my brother Paul and I run to this day. So again, my father was just an orthotist, and for the first 25 years or so of our company's history, we were just an orthotics laboratory. We had one small location in downtown Pittsburgh, and we were, a fledgling business. My father and mother working very hard to make it something. And my brother stepped into the business, I believe it was around 1985, and I stepped into it in 1990. And we've grown the business in that period of time today to what we are now with approximately 75 employees. We've got 8 patient locations around the city, and we service every hospital, or just about every hospital in the southwestern Pennsylvania area. So a lot has happened in these 50-plus years of our life, but it really just started with a couple moving to Pittsburgh, responding to a job opening, and deciding to take it from there.
What was the training like that your dad had to go through? Was there any prerequisite, or did he just sign up for the job?
No, actually, that's an interesting story. My parents both are Puerto Rican, so I'm Puerto Rican, and they both are uneducated, frankly. They never completed high school.
Yeah.
My father enlisted in the Marine Corps for fighting in World War II, and he lied about his age. And so he would be able to enlist in the Marine Corps. And after the war, he then completed his GED in order to be able to have a high school diploma. The story goes, as I've been told, that my parents lived with my mother's sister and her husband, he being an orthopedic surgeon. And that's a long story in and of itself. But my uncle got to know my father rather well and said, Manny, you're very good with your hands. You should consider becoming a brace maker. To which my dad said, oh, what's that? And my uncle explained to him that as an orthopedic surgeon, of course, we work very closely with brace makers. And I think it's a career you'd be good at. So my father ended up pushing himself into the NYU school. It was called the Institute for Crippled and Disabled in New York City. It later became part of the NYU Medical School. Wow. But my father kind of pushed his way through the doors into that school, and that's pretty significant of my father's personality, and it's what drove the creation of our company. But he ended up completing the certification course. He was able to sit for the boards to become a certified orthotist, of not fully completing all of the requirements at that time, such as having a college degree. My father never got one. But he did sit for the boards for certification and passed them with the highest possible score of any student that year. And the board for certification was quite stumped because they didn't know what to do with him. Here was a man who didn't have a college education, but yet had scored the highest on the boards. And so they did choose to certify him. Wow. And back in 1957, 1958, my father became a certified orthotist. So perhaps parts of that story, again, reflect his personality and drive in creating a company for himself. And so that's how Delatour Orthopedic Appliances got started.
It's incredible how just a little bit of, I shouldn't even say a little bit, but having a drive and a desire can lead into something 50 years later that has grown into this incredible company. We're sitting at the Delatour office. There's a beautiful shop. We as students first came across Delatour orthotics and prosthetics as students at our program, and we got to do a tour here, and we got a lecture. I shouldn't say lecture. We got a presentation by Drew that was very informative and engaging, and we got a tour of the facility. And I don't know, I think it made an impression with all of us so much that we sought out you all, that we wanted to speak with you again. It was just that impactful. And so, Ed, thank you so much for sharing that part of the background and the story of Delatour. And I think what we'll do is we'll transition into sort of sharing the story between Drew and Brian. And so we will get into that here in just 1 second.
So after those kind words from Ed Delatour, it is now Eric, Will, and myself with Drew Buffett and Brian Mosier, and we're going to get into a great discussion here about the prosthetists, the clinical aspect of everything going into Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics, and then also a big component of what the client and customer of the Delatour product and brand really has to go through. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Drew, if you don't mind kicking us off here with the discussion.
No, not at all. I just wanted to add on to what, kind of piggyback on what Ed was talking about in terms of the history, because Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics was basically established as an orthotic company. When Paul Delatour, his brother, who is the CPO, the clinical specialist in the company, got out of school, he went down to Kansas to do his residency. And at that point, Delatour Orthotics was really Delatour Orthotics. Prosthetics was not even really much of a part of the company at all. So Paul, in the early 90s, reached out to me via another contact through the company. I was working in Virginia at the time, and we were talking probably for almost a full year, probably on a monthly basis, and he kept saying, Drew, please, I want you to come up. And I finally did fly up for an interview, and then the next thing I knew, I was walking into Fifth Avenue, being the first certified prosthetist that they had hired. They had one prosthetic technician at the time, and the turnaround was a little bit slower because they were very busy. They became a trauma orthotic company with the halos and with the TLSOs and things like that. So they kind of established themselves as the trauma orthotic company in the city. So prosthetics was kind of on the back burner. I think it was maybe less than 1% in terms of overall revenue of the company when I got on board. So they charged me to basically, build the department. And so Paul just kind of said, here you go. And he kind of wiped his hands of the prosthetics. didn't do any more modifying and said, take it over. And so that was 20 some odd years ago, and we've slowly grown the prosthetic side of things. Been a little bit of an uphill battle because it was basically seen as an orthotic company for all those years, and over the years we've made some good progress, and I think we became closer to 30% of the overall revenue of the company, and we still are striving to grow and hopefully become 50% of the company in terms of the overall revenue. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we're able to service the greater population, both the orthotic patients and the prosthetic patients, because it is orthotics and prosthetics in the name of the company. So, that's pretty much where we ended up, and that's what we're trying to strive for. So.
And of course, we can just say, as clinicians that are going to start our journey here in our career very soon, how difficult it must have been to pioneer your way through that process, having nobody to really hold your hand or show you, this is how it's been done for 100 years. That hats off to you guys for accomplishing that. And like you said, the most important thing along that journey has been providing service for a community and really building upon the relationships that Delatour and their clients have been able to form. Could you guys, Drew, Brian, elaborate a little bit on how that role between the prosthetist and the amputee, or the client of Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics, has been evolving over the years?
Sure, I can kind of start with that in terms of how we became, where we've arrived to today. Is that we really had to start off in a clinical setting because we really didn't have a presence in the hospitals. Orthotically, they did. They were called, all the time, immediately. They responded quickly. They started carrying pagers. It became a real one of those real quick turnaround time type situations with the physicians. And prosthetically, we had to establish our relationship. So it grew out of clinical settings. We worked very closely with a local physiatrist by the name of Dr. Marianne McNevich. She was running a clinic up the street from Fifth Avenue up in Mercy Hospital. And so we got involved in the clinical settings. And so we would start to build our clientele by attending those clinics on a weekly basis. She would get new patients to come in, and we were put on a rotation because there were other companies in town already doing prosthetics, and they were majority of their business was prosthetics, and we pretty much just had to establish relationships with the physicians, with the physical therapists in the hospital, and then that kind of ballooned out to other clinics, and then that ballooned out to contracts that we would receive through the insurance, and Joyce, our practice administrator, was huge when it came to that, to establish these contracts, because when you have Highmark and you have UPMCs of the world, in order to do the prosthetic side of things, we still had to prove that we could do it and that we had the certified staff to be able to do it. So kind of a building block. We just had to start with relationships and build from there.
I think that's such a perfect segue, too, about relationship building, and that, we're sitting here with you and Brian together. And Brian, if you're comfortable, I was just going to ask you if you don't mind sharing your story a little bit about how you got to know, your personal story and your journey as being an amputee and that process, and then how you got to know Delatour and a little bit about the relationship and how you first met Drew. I think it would be really interesting.
Oh, absolutely. I became an amputee in August of 2012. I was swimming. I cut my foot swimming. I love to swim. I cut my foot swimming, and I'm a diabetic, and I knew I've got to get this looked at. Can't let this get out of control. And so I went and I saw a podiatrist, and she looked at it and she debrided the wound, which is what they do, and she wanted to get an X-ray of my foot. And so without wrapping my foot or doing anything to it, she had me walk. She's debrided my foot, so my foot is bleeding. And she had me walk from the exam room to their little X-ray room, stand on the X-ray machine, so I'm just bleeding, right? And if you know anything about bacteria and germs, is that liquid just sucks all that bacteria in. Yeah. And so blood is a liquid, and so it sucked the bacteria into my foot. And within about a week, I was in septic shock with multiple organ failure.
Oh, goodness.
And my wife took me to our local hospital, who was not equipped to deal with that, but they had life flights like, we're not taking him until you stabilize him. So there was a balance there, and it was, I don't remember much, but I, obviously could have died. I didn't, thankfully. And when I got to the hospital in Columbus, Ohio, we were living in Ohio at the time, the surgeon says to me, you have two options, your life or your leg. There's no choice. I said, do whatever you can to save my life. Do you have any questions? How long until I can swim? and that was it. Because I said, I love to swim.
Yeah.
And so what happened was after about a week in ICU or so, I woke up and there was a gentleman there from my first prosthetics company, and he was the owner of the company, and cold call or whatever. I don't know how they get notified, but they were notified. And because of that connection, I went there. What came about that I decided to retire. I was a pastor, and I decided, you know what, I've had enough. And I decided to retire. My wife wanted to move back to Pittsburgh to be close to family. And I asked my prosthetist, I said, how do I find the new prosthetist? And he said, and this was just the seed, right? Sometimes people just plant a seed because I didn't think much of it. And he said, if you're going to go with anyone in Pittsburgh, you need to go with Delatour. He said, I don't know them. He said, but I've researched the company because I had told him for a few months that I may be moving. He said, I've researched the company. And he said, it seems like they have people who have been classically trained. And he said, that's what you want. He said, you don't want someone that's went to a seminar and thinks they're a prosthetist. And so when I came back, I did a Google search for Pittsburgh prosthetics. And it was maybe a month before I decided to make a contact. It was as nerve-wracking as can be because I thought I had this really great care in Ohio. I had good care, but I thought it was great. I hated to leave. I was very nervous about that, and it produced a lot of anxiety and a lot of worry for me. And the process of elimination was three companies came up in the search. And the first company is a publicly traded company that I previously had dealings with before becoming an amputee. And in those dealings, they treated me like a number. They did not treat me like a person. They did not value me as a person, and I knew I did not want to go with that company. The second company had a horrible website, and I'm a social media person, so I did not go with that company. And so I was on the Delatour website, and they had a contact box. And I said, well, if it's meant to be, because I don't like to call, or at least then, now I'm fine with it now, but I don't like to call places then. And I said, if it's meant to be, someone will contact me. So I filled out the box, and I don't know what the time frame was, but it didn't take that long, and Drew called me. And we spoke about the process, and that was, for me to go and see to the amputee clinic that Dr. Munin runs, and that's where it started. And here we are 2 years later.
Wow.
That I've been coming here.
And you know what, the story and why we wanted to really get your perspective, Brian, is there's such an emotional component, and thank you for sharing your story really with us and our listeners. But it separates maybe the relationship that someone that has had an amputation would have with their physician that you mentioned, or your podiatrist even for that matter. Just the way you told the story makes it seem like how you came to meet Delatour, how you came to meet Drew as a prosthetist is just, it has an emotional component. You were, of course, in shock for a while and then anxious about reaching out to anyone because someone initially was more or less granted to you at the hospital. And, it's something we could talk about maybe at a later time is, the choices of the amputee to reach out for the best care, find out what's best for you. And then it forged into a friendship. There's such an emotional component. So I want to piggyback off that statement and ask you, Brian, about some of the key relationships that a client of Delatour, who would you meet along your journey? And you had mentioned your physician. You had mentioned how you first met Drew, which seems to be the first person to pick up the phone call, actually. But, what are some other aspects of your care? Who would you meet? Sure. And how would that be different from maybe, your dealings with a physical therapist or your dealings with your physician? Sure.
Well, one of the things, and so the prosthetic care that I experienced in Ohio compared to what we do here in Western Pennsylvania is two totally different things. In Ohio, you would have your surgeon would write the initial prescription for your prosthesis. And then you would go to the prosthetist. When they needed something, they would call your PCP. This is what the prescription needs to say. Make it say it, fax it to me, done. That doesn't happen here in Western Pennsylvania. You go to the amputee clinic, and there are a variety of doctors. I see Dr. Munin, who oversees the clinic, and so he's pretty much the boss. He makes the decisions, and he does take your input and listens to what you have to say, but he expects you to do certain things. When I began this journey, I got to the point, well, not when I began, but I got to the point during this journey where I was 500 pounds, and I couldn't walk well. I ended up in the hospital for 47 days and almost died. And I couldn't walk well. I couldn't really do anything. And I wanted a different foot. And Dr. Munin says, if you expect me to write a prescription for a new foot, you have to lose weight. I said, fine. So 230 pounds less later, I said, I want my foot. And so I got a new foot because he said, you did what I asked you to do, so here's your reward kind of deal. And so you have, and we call him a PMNR doctor, physical medicine and rehabilitation, which I'm sure you guys know that. But so he's kind of maybe the captain of the team in a lot of ways. When you're at those appointments with Dr. Munin, Kate is there with me, who's one of our CPs here. And so she's able to make any adjustments or talk about any changes that we need or want to make. She's then able to come back and communicate with Drew about what happened or what didn't happen or what should happen. And then so you what happens is you develop this team. So you have your PM&R doctor and you have your prosthetist and you have the company. And so you get this team and then they consult with PT or OT if that's, I always like to say, if it's medically necessary. Because Dr. Munin is very big on stressing medical necessity. If you want insurance to pay for something, I hear this every time I go, it has to be, you have to prove medical necessity. Yes, Dr. Munin, I understand, And so, and you kind of, I don't like to say it this way, but it's true. You encounter this cast of characters because when the first time I came here, I was actually going to the Harmer office at the time. And so I just kind of knew Drew and I had known Kate from, going to see Dr. Munin. And for me, it was more convenient to come to this office. And so then you meet Tracy. Tracy's the one, when you call for an appointment, hey, I need to see Drew. And I probably had Tracy on speed dial right away because I was constantly calling, I need to see Drew, I need to see Drew, I need to see Drew. And the thing is, though, unlike maybe a corporation, it's not like, we don't have time or it's going to be 3 weeks or a month. It's like, okay, I can get you in on this day. And you just say, okay, and come because you want the appointment. And, so that makes it nice. But as you come, you see other people because since this is the corporate offices here, you see other people and you get to know other people. And what you learn is that you have an entire company vested in how you're doing. You don't just show up at some of these places, and you have maybe the receptionist in your process, hey, what's up? How's it going? Nice, and they just kind of ignore what you say. Like yesterday, for example, I went to the doctor and the nurse was like making small talk with me and I'm just responding and you could tell she's not listening to a thing I'm saying. So I quit responding, and she didn't notice. But, you don't really get that here. People, they're truly vested, interested in you. And that's part, I think, of building that relationship.
Absolutely. And that only reinforces, I think, the conversation we're having that this relationship is a unique one in the medical field, and there's no other way to really look at it. I mean, the amount of time that you spend together, you mentioned it before, the phone calls, I need to see Drew, I need to see Drew. That piques my interest in, without being too specific, how often should an amputee expect to meet with their prosthetist? Maybe in the early stages where you're first learning your capacity and learning a new device versus as you've developed and you want to, maybe get vetted for. What's the medical necessity limits? When can I move to a new device? How often can you expect to meet with Drew?
For me, it's been any time I need to or feel I need to.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's been the smallest, most minor, what might seem insignificant. But it's just that little tweak. You'll be walking and you'll say, this just doesn't feel right. And you make a little tweak or you add a sock or you do something, and the appointment might last 5 minutes. It might last an hour. But you get that in. And for me, I say this jokingly, but there's some truth to it, that sometimes you see your prosthetist more than you see your own family, or so it seems.
Yeah.
Because a prosthetist or the prosthesis itself can be so finicky, and there's so many movements and so many things that can be done, and the way I like it or what works for me isn't going to work for the next amputee. So all these little adjustments and things that need to be made. I know amputees that I talk to that might see their prosthetist once every 6 months. And I'm like, how do you live?
Drew, are you on call?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
We do have a weekend call schedule, and even in the evenings, pretty much I'm on throughout the week, and then we have our staff rotates for the weekend on call. So
that's great.
We do have patients that are admitted in for gait training
at
various hospitals and clinics throughout the area. So we are very much aware of who is in the hospital for their gait training, and if the physical therapist is having any issues, they know to call us. In fact, we try to be there for the first session. When the new amputee is admitted, we'll get in and make sure we're there so the therapist understands the donning and doffing issues and also just the type of prostheses they have. Getting back to the relationship, it's definitely a symbiotic relationship. It's long-term and it's very close. And so it's one of those situations that, once we start off seeing a patient, we really, like Brian was saying, we become a team in itself because we rely on the patient to give us a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
And if you go in there kind of blinded and saying, I know everything, and because I'm not an amputee, I don't feel what they feel. I have to be empathetic and listen to what they're telling me, and they in turn, will let me know that, which helps their care. So if the practitioner goes in kind of thinking they know everything, I mean, obviously we're trained and we're skilled in certain areas, but when it comes to the actual feeling that the patient is feeling inside the socket, when they're walking on the foot, the various terrains, different things that they're getting feedback from, we have to cue them in a sense. And some patients are better about letting us know what's going on than others. A lot of times it's a visual thing that we can see it. But when we get the feedback from the patient, and Brian is excellent at that. I mean, he's been wonderful in terms of his feedback, and he tells me if it's not right or something's not feeling proper, then we work on getting it corrected. So it's truly a long-term relationship, we hope, in many respects, because getting back to that, initially, we see patients once a week or maybe twice a week. When we first get a call from a hospital or we go see the patient in the hospital, that's where the process begins, either in a clinical setting where we're on a rotation or we're referred by a physician directly. Then we get in there and start fitting them with shrinkers, trying to get that limb shape down, desensitized. Once the sutures come out, kind of depends if the patient's diabetic or not, or whether they're trauma. Depends on how quickly we can get involved with the care. But once they're healed and we get the go-ahead from the physician, then that's when things start. And we start with measurements, castings, get them back in for check socket fittings. Probably a couple check sockets just to make sure that we're getting the fit like we want it to be. And then we go on to a definitive from there. So within the first 6 to 8 weeks, we see folks at least once a week, maybe twice. It kind of depends. And then once that's done, when we get them into a definitive socket, they finish their physical therapy. Then it's really on an on-call basis in terms of when they go to clinics. Usually 6 months, the physicians will follow up with them. And as Brian was alluding to, we do have a very unique situation here in Western Pennsylvania with the clinical settings. And we work with 4 or 5 physiatrists who specialize in prosthetics alone. I mean, they're physical medicine doctors, but they've taken it on themselves to learn prosthetics. For years, we would get blank prescriptions that basically said right BK, right transtibial or right leg, with no components on there. And so it was really up to us to kind of build the prostheses according to that particular prescription. Those days are long gone. With the healthcare reform, good or bad, I mean, it's just become very tightened down in terms of how we go about prescribing and justifying what we're doing. So in many respects, it's actually a good thing from my perspective. But the physiatrists that we work with, they know prosthetics, and so we obviously consult with them as well. And with all the new updates and new technology, we're kind of feeding them and saying, hey, this is what's going on, and they in turn will prescribe. And some physiatrists have closer control than others, and others will kind of let us do a few things when it comes to what the patient sees online now with different components. Say, I want to try this. In fact, when Brian was talking about his foot, he saw that online, and came in and said, hey, I'd like to try this foot. We trialed it. He was actually walking on that foot when he went back to see Dr. Munich. Dr. Munin. Sorry about that. Because the manufacturers now give us 30 to 60 days to trial feet because there's so many out there. There's hundreds of different feet, and we try to match those feet to the patient in terms of their activity level and their lifestyle. And so we'll take that foot. And so Brian saw one. I'm like, yeah, let's give it a shot. He really liked it, and he went in, and then Dr. Munin challenged him to lose the weight because that particular foot had a certain weight limit on it, and we couldn't fit it otherwise.
Yeah.
And Brian, did his due diligence and got down to the weight where we could fit it, and that's what he's currently on.
Wow.
So it really takes the patient too. I mean, if the patient, we do some educational spots for the physical therapists for earning CEUs, and basically one of the things I always talk about is motivation. And if a patient's not motivated, whether they're 5 years old all the way up to 90 years old, if they're not motivated, no matter what we do from a prosthetic perspective, the patient won't be successful. But if they're motivated and they are willing to put the time in, it's not an easy thing, as Brian can attest to. This is a whole life-changing thing that happens when someone experiences an amputation. But if they're willing to put the time in, and the practitioner is as well, then they're going to see good things and have good results. But unless they kind of take over themselves as well, it usually doesn't happen. It becomes a closet prosthesis where we go through all that and they pretty much just stick it aside and don't wear it.
Yeah.
So.
And if I could piggyback on the relationship aspect, of what happens, specifically with Delatour. When I was in the hospital, I went in the hospital. I had a cardiac issue. I have heart failure, and so I had filled up with fluid because I didn't listen to my doctor and take my medicine like I should. And that's on me, and I owned that. But while I was in there, Dr. Munin thought it was important to get me into inpatient rehab for my leg because I hadn't been walking. And Delatour was with me the entire way, whether it was Drew or Kate or Rachel or someone, a couple of the others, Brian and a couple others came to the hospital to see me and to make sure that I got a prosthesis that fit properly, because they're, with the program that I went into, if you're an amputee, they're not going to accept you into that program without you having a leg for therapy, because it's pointless. It's to do the inpatient rehab without your leg, your prosthesis. And so they made sure that I had the prosthesis to get into that environment. And when I remember, I was when you're in the hospital, and it was a Saturday, and Delatour was closed. But Brian was on call, and he came over and put some padding in my socket so that I could, because I was in therapy, I was just in horrible pain, and put the padding in, fixed the problem, got the therapy done, and moved on. Last year, Memorial Day weekend of last year, it was the Sunday, I was at the YMCA, I was on a leg brush machine, and I broke a component on the bottom. There's a plate on the bottom of the prosthesis that I broke because I probably did too much weight on the leg press machine. And I'm like, what am I going to do? It's Sunday. Delatour is closed. Tomorrow's Memorial Day. Delatour is closed. So I called the hospital line that we have, and whoever was on call, Brian was on call, and he called me back, and he said, you need me to come to your house? I said, no, I'm going to come to you so you have the parts you need to fix this. And so I went over to, I call it West Mifflin. That's, when you look on our website, that's not what they call it, and that's fine. That's okay. So I went over there, and he fixed my leg, and I went on my way the rest of the weekend. And I've talked to other amputees who've had similar things happen. They're like, I had to wait a week. And I'm just like, in my mind, because of how I've been treated, what I've experienced, I'm like, that's unacceptable. I don't want to sit around and not be able to use my leg for a week, when it's, I don't know how to fix it. And they know this. I will not try to fix my prosthesis because I will bring it in parts if I do. And nobody wants that to happen. Maybe I'll bring it in parts, but no. And so I think, for the relational concept, to be able to do that and say, this is how we want to treat our patients, because this is, it wasn't even what I expected, because I didn't have that anywhere else. It was just something happened. Oh, well, you wait. Yeah. When I first moved here and first met Drew, my prosthesis, I had a horrible fitting prosthesis. I'd be driving somewhere with my wife, and we would have to pull off to the side of the road, and I would have to take it off. It hurt so bad. And I can remember one of the times going to see Drew, and it was just hurting so bad. I just took it off before I even got in for my appointment. And so, but through the process that they do here, took care of all that. Yeah. And it's just that time and that quality work and craftsmanship to make sure we get it right. And that's, to me, that's really how you build the relationship and what makes me want to come back.
Yeah. Well, it's great to hear how this relationship has been built, and sort of the communication that has to happen in order to have a successful recovery. And I wanted to kind of go back just for a second and talk about that motivational component that Drew, you had brought up. And Brian, I was curious if you feel open to talking about it. Those initial first days after experiencing an amputation, sort of what's going through your mind. I can't say it's easy. In my mind, it's easy for someone from the outside to say you should be motivated to get that leg and get up and walking, but we're not going through that. What was going through your mind, and then what was it like to try to walk for the first time with your leg? And then after that, Drew, if you can fill it in with us a little bit, like what's going through your mind as you're watching Brian walk, like the things you're looking for and some of those things that you see that maybe Brian, just from not working with a prosthetic leg enough, you're looking for and trying to help him with.
From the perspective of what's going through your mind, if I said, this is what was going through my mind, you need that censor button like every other second. So we won't do that. But I think what goes through your mind is like, this is a life-altering, life-changing thing that just happened. For me, just me personally, I can't speak for any other amputee. For me, I was happy to be alive. Because when the doctor told me you were in septic shock with multiple organ failure, and less than 4% of all people with exactly what you have survive. Less than 4, that's astronomical odds, especially when I first went to a small county hospital that wasn't really equipped for that. Astronomical odds, I was thankful to be alive. And so other things, play into that, and you look at, well, maybe there's a bigger plan for my life, and that. One of the things I knew, because growing up, my grandmother was an amputee, and I didn't think about it a lot as a kid. I didn't think, I might need to know some things later in life, kind of thing. But I was exposed to it, And one of the things that I knew when I was in the hospital and off the medicines and could think clearly and speak, I said, I need to see a psychiatrist, a psychologist, whatever you have. I said, amputees go through the stages of grief just like when you lose someone. And I said, I want to know how to handle all of that. I said, here's my background. I said, I have a background in counseling, but I'm not going to counsel myself, and talk to myself. So I said, and they did. So like as soon as I was able to, to speak, and they had me off the high doses of pain medicine and whatnot, I started seeing someone. And I advise any amputee to do that from the start, because people are always like, where do I go? What do I do? And they end up with depression or anxiety. And it gets bad for some people, unfortunately. And don't be afraid to talk to someone. People think you get the stigma or you're going to get diagnosed. I ain't getting diagnosis. I was a guy that went through a traumatic experience. They saw that. I talked to the person as long as I needed to, and we were done. And it worked wonders just to have that, someone to help me process the stages of grief and the different emotions that you go through. And that's just another part of what I would consider now, the team concept. It's just like a physical therapist, as an amputee, you may not always need a physical therapist, but for a period of time, you certainly do.
Absolutely.
And so while you need them, you have them there. And for me, it was the same thing. While I needed that psychologist, they were there. And I think, when you're, this is what I'm dealing with. Because it wasn't like, a lot of people I talk to, a lot of amputees are fatalists, what I call fatalists, and they're like, oh, I just don't know what to do. I might as well just give up and kill myself. And where I'm at now, like, I'm probably not always like the most sympathetic with people, because I'm just like, you need to just get out of this. My buddy's like, last night, he's not an amputee. We were talking about weight loss. He's like, why are you yelling at me? I was like, I'm not yelling. I said, I'm just passionate. I said, I just want to help you and see you succeed. And so my voice probably goes up when I get passionate. But so it's one of those things where, you have two choices. You can look at it and say, this is going to define me, or you can say, I'm going to use this to grow me. And had I let it define me, I wouldn't be sitting here with you guys. It'd be someone else that would be sitting here. Because, I don't know if any of you were here when I told the story, but I've told the story here a couple of times that a month or so ago when I went to get my dog's allergy medicine at the vet, the lady's like, how are you so happy for an amputee? Like, what do you expect me to be? You expect me to walk around all depressed and sad because I lost it? Like, big freaking deal. Like, whatever. Now I have a story to tell, so.
And you mentioned walking around, doing so.
Right.
The grieving process, I'm sure, is something that comes up every now and again where you have to revisit some aspects that you were able to move past. But since you brought up walking, and that, again, was something I think we would love to hear Drew's perspective on, but for you first, Brian, how was that initial first step, pun intended?
The very first step I took on a prosthesis was amazing, because I spent 7 months in the nursing home post-amputation. And during that time, I did not have a prosthesis, just for healing reasons. And then I had it, I got one, and I was never able to wear it because I had to have a revision. Like, I literally got the prosthesis, and the next day the doctor's like, I'm sorry, we have to do a revision. So obviously that prosthesis is now, no good for, kept the foot and all that, but the socket was done. And so then you're like, I gotta go through this again. And it was a quicker healing time because there wasn't like mass infection involved, and so I healed a lot quicker. But when you take that first step, it's amazing. Like when I left, I was using a walker, and like my wife and I went to Five Guys, and just to be able to walk in, you go through all this time, and just because I was in the nursing home, I still went out and did that. I still had a social life and left and went and did things. But to be able to walk in somewhere and you're not like in a wheelchair, that's amazing. When you've done that, that was 7 months of that. So the better part of a year, and now you can walk. It's amazing. You're just so thankful. I mean, really, you don't. And that for those first steps, you're not thinking about what kind of socket you have, what kind of foot you have, your component. You're not thinking about any of that with that first time. A couple years down the road, it'll be 5 years this August, and you think about that now. But just that, it was amazing.
Awesome. And Brian, when you're seeing that happen, that transformation of someone being in a wheelchair, learning how to put the prosthetic on, walk with it, what's that like for you, and what are some of the clinical things that you're thinking of during that time?
Thinking about a lot of things, obviously. But no, it's a wonderful feeling. I mean, that's basically why I got into the field in the first place, was to Because I think when we do some teaching up at the PIT program, and I kind of go around the room and I ask some of the students in O&P about why they got into the field, a lot of them come back to the fact that they like to help patients, help people, but they also can see results fairly quickly. When you first see somebody, fit them with a shrinker sock into a check socket, and within a couple weeks, we can get them up and standing, and taking some steps. And so we get a wide variety of emotions, particularly if family members are in the room. But it's quite a remarkable time in these folks' lives because they've been through so much, and every patient handles it differently. They really do. Now, when Brian first came into the office, he was rolling in a wheelchair, and he had his prostheses on. I believe it the first time he came in. But I could tell right away. I question things, as far as just how am I going to make sure I can get this guy up and moving. But I never questioned Brian. As far as his motivation, he was engaged. He was asking question after question, talking about different systems. He told me what he'd had already, which really helped me to determine what we were going to do next. And the prescription for Dr. Munin was pretty thorough as well. But we never know if that's going to work until we actually do it. And so we went through the check socket phases and just changed the system a little bit for him. He had lost his fit, but that's pretty normal because, initially the first 6 to 8 weeks. And how long was it before you came? Again, it was when you came to us the first time?
How long before I came the first time, or after
how
the
long
first
have you
visit?
had the amputation? And you had your socket already. You had your leg
Let's see. I had the amputation in August of 2012, and I came to Delatour for the first time in roughly January of 15.
Okay, so so some time there.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously the prosthesis he rolled in on, because he was still in his chair, only walking a few steps. We were able to get him up in the parallel bars a few steps, and that was really about it because he was in so much discomfort. But his limb had changed. The volume, he had atrophied, and that's pretty normal. So that was something that was pretty much par for the course when it comes to fitting somebody with a prosthetic socket, is adapting to those changes that have happened physiologically inside the limb itself. So we started over. We basically started over with different liners, new castings, and had some issues with some skin irritation, but we found the combination. But it wasn't something we hit in the first time. But Brian, like I stated, he was engaged. He would let me know what was going on in contact. And so, he's as much responsible for his recovery and his care, more so really than I am. I'm a kind of a tool in a sense to help him get up and move, and that's what pretty much that's what we've done.
Well, that relationship, between you, it has to be strong. We have had conversations with other guests in the past that talk about the strength of, a client with a physical therapist comes a lot of times from how often are you seeing it.
Right.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like this relationship it blows that out of the water. You guys developed together. I had been thinking in my mind, how long does a prosthetic component, or we'll say the prosthesis, the whole thing, top to bottom, last? But now, after hearing your story, that question's out the window because it sounds like this process is constant tinkering. It takes some expertise, know-how. It takes motivation, and you have to have questions. You have to be willing to listen to your body and go through changes. And both of you have to meet somewhere in the middle to openly communicate. Correct. Sounds like constantly, right?
Yes.
And you mentioned some parts of a prosthetic between the socket or the line or the componentry, the foot. In that story, it sounds like every part of the prosthetic changed at least once, right?
Absolutely.
So I guess I'll follow through with that. Is how often? I'll ask Drew first. Will a client coming in, should they expect to see changes in componentry? Maybe in those, you said in the first 2 weeks, you're just focused on getting up, getting your prosthesis on. But after that,
right.
How long, how many changes does someone go through before they are ambulating and really independent and feels pretty confident with what they have?
Excellent question. It is varied. It's really varied. We look at function first and then performance later. So when a patient first comes in or going through a clinic, then we look at the components that are going to get this patient up and moving first. So function happens to be, there's different K levels that we work off of. In terms of how active a patient or how strong the patient's going to be. And that determines the components that we start off with. If they are in a K2, which is basically an ambulator, they can't vary their cadence, then that helps us determine the components. If they're a K3, where they are a community ambulator but can vary their cadence, in other words, if they're walking across the street and a bus happens to be coming, can they move? Can they jog a little bit? Can they change their cadence and their speed? then that determines the components as well. So there are guidelines that we work off of, and the initial components, as long as something doesn't change functionally or physiologically, they should last a year and or more. But chances are in that first 6 months, there's going to be socket changes happening because of the physiological changes. Now, Medicare guidelines, again, every 6 months we can be reevaluated. We can reevaluate the patient. And if there's a determination that there's a physiological change within the limb, say we started off fitting a socket and they were just in their gel liner and with no socks to help with control volume. But if they've shrunk down to the point where then 10, 12, 15 ply, then there's a physiological change. So within those guidelines, we are eligible to provide a new socket to that patient. Functional as well. Say we start off with somebody in a K2 level, because they've been determined by the physician, by the physical therapist, and by ourselves, that this patient's basically going to use this prosthesis to ambulate to the sink, to the commode, in the kitchen, maybe stand a little bit, but they're not really going to use it for light jogging, or their speed's going to be very just standard, stable. However, if they prove themselves within that 6 month time frame that they're able to do more with their prosthesis, which is what Brian had to do to get this foot, that he was able to walk around more and various cadence and do things like that, then that's the functional need as met. So then we can bump up the componentry from there. We can go from a K2 component to a K3 foot, so the patient's going to be more active, and that's pretty much how that's determined.
Sure, and there's also the component of the client's perspective, right? You said there's
absolutely, yes.
Hundreds
Yes.
of
Yes.
feet, and if they fall
Right.
within these guidelines
That
of
is
function,
absolutely
and
right.
it truly is. It's a meeting between the client and the professional, the machine, and
Absolutely. Well, even within
and
these
the
K
man.
levels, they always talk about potential. So how do you gauge that? There's a few things that we can use to do that. There's a couple of tests out there that we use, but we never know, and that's where the motivation comes in, because somebody could test out very high, as a K3, K4 ambulator, but then if they're not motivated, it doesn't really matter.
Drew, do you mind breaking down real quick what a K level is for someone who may not be familiar with?
Basically, a K level is a guideline that Medicare goes by, and it's something that they determine, and it's kind of put in place to make sure that we're justifying the components that we put on the patient. Because unfortunately, there have been cases where somebody would be, say, you have somebody who is an elderly transfemoral amputee, and somebody has put them into a microprocessor knee that they're not even close to using in terms of the function. So then obviously that's not what we want. I mean, we want to be able to fit the component to meet the patient's functional level. And that's what the K levels are. They're basically levels that determine, like a K0 is somebody who basically, will not be eligible for a prosthesis. A K1 amputee would probably be somebody who would use it for just transfers. And we have some of those. We have somebody, the VA who may, has a bilateral right at this point, but really they just want to make sure that the patient can transfer from the bed to the commode, and maybe stand up with a walker just to straighten out their back on occasion. Then you have somebody who's basically going to use a walker, or maybe lost-strand crutches or something, that will be able to stand up and to walk again from their bed into the bathroom to the kitchen, but basically just very limited ambulation. And so you can think about all those levels. And we also have kids. We have a lot of pediatrics that, they're all over the place and, breaking things all the time. And and from that perspective, when also a guideline is if they break things and it's irreparable, it's damage, then they're eligible for something else as well. So between physiological function and then just damage to the prosthetic is when they're eligible for either a new foot or a new socket, things like that. I just saw a gentleman up in our Butler office. He's a farmer. We made him a socket probably a little over a year ago, but we made it out of carbon. But he's up and down out of a tractor all the time. He's on his knees all the time. And he came in, and the proximal brim of the socket was pretty much delaminating, pretty much falling apart. But because of the functional need that he has, then we're eligible to get him a new socket.
Yeah, and I wanted to elaborate on that as well, Drew, is that you've mentioned as the process goes along for the client, they're meeting functional goals, medical necessity goals, they're improving in function and movement, plus their physiology is changing, of course. Sounds like there's a lot of changing components. It gets pretty complicated, and just at first hearing about it, it sounds also expensive, right? With so much changing parts. I mean, it's almost constant interaction with a service. So in this day and age of the high deductible health plans, and you're seeing a lot of patients here. with varying, everything from this farmer who's doing just about everything to Brian's story, which he shared, what kind of out-of-pocket expenses do you see patients, maybe you guys can collaborate, I'll ask both of your answers here, out-of-pocket expenses for the amputee? It sounds like between Medicare and guidelines, and if you're able to break it, there's certain fail-safes, but there has to be an expense above and beyond that. So I'll ask you first.
Absolutely. No, there is, but again, getting back to the point is, we just can't do this stuff, haphazardly. I mean, it has to be justified. And once we reach that justification point and we get the prescription and the physician's on board with it, because we really rely on the physician notes. I mean, basically, if we can't proceed without making sure that they're on board, and we follow their guidelines, but our notes are important, but they have theirs have more weight to them. So as long as we can justify it, then we're justified in terms of subbing it to insurance. But getting back to your question in terms of expense, there has been more of a shift over toward patient responsibility, and that's partially due to the changes that have been happening in healthcare. They've been talking about this for a long time, is making it more of a retail type situation, so the patients are aware. Because for the longest time, you bill your insurance, but the patient isn't aware of what's going on. So they felt like, if patients became more responsible for their part and their share, that the cost of healthcare would come down, hopefully because there's introducing competition, but also that patients will start to shop around. And that is happening. I mean, that is happening. But on the other side of it is that we have to make sure that the patient is aware of those costs. Because prior to, maybe a few years prior to some of the changes in the ACA, we may go through this and then all of a sudden the patient would get a bill for 20%. And they're like, hey, wait a minute, this is pretty expensive stuff. So now on the front end, we're doing more with the billing staff so that they're aware of the contracts we have. There's different contracts as far as fee schedules, but also making sure that the patient is aware up front before we proceed with what their deductible would be or what their coinsurance would be if they don't have any coinsurance to cover that. So we're very, very careful about that, much more so than we've ever been, because unfortunately those out-of-pocket expenses have increased on the patient. So we want to make sure that they give us the go-ahead before we just make something and then all of a sudden they're hit with this tremendous bill that they can't afford to pay.
Sure.
So. And I'd like to hear Brian's input on that. I mean, the transparency is essentially what it sounds like. It's very absolutely important. And in an industry, as PTs and other healthcare professionals are moving forward with an industry that's changing, that transparency seems to be kind of lost in the number of different options and the internet and the ever-changing reimbursement rates. Brian, what's that process like for you, having that transparency? Is that important, and to what extent?
It is important to me. I'm an anomaly in all of this because I don't have any out-of-pocket cost. This is I don't know how many legs, but since I've been with Delatour, and the reason is I'm covered by 3 different insurances, which most people I'm blessed. I told Will the other day I don't believe in luck, but I feel very fortunate to have fallen into the situation that I did. But I was a pastor for 20 years. They had a long-term disability program that I was smart enough to pay into, which provides me with a 3rd level of insurance. So, so through, I have Medicare and I have UPMC, so that's my primary, so that can be billed. And then because I have what's considered, I forget how they word it, 2-tier, 2-level disability, I'm an amputee and I have congestive heart failure. So that automatic, regardless of income or anything else, that qualifies me for Medicaid. So then I get on UPMC's dual plan. So I have Medicare, Medicaid, plus I have the long-term disability plan that I paid into for 20 years kicks in that 3rd insurance that once I retired was designed to pick up Medicare's 20% that they didn't pay. So there's all of that can be billed. And if I ever get a bill, I'm just going to resubmit it to somebody I say that like half-heartedly and kind of joking at the same time, but I'm just very blessed that way. And I know, and I talk to amputees every day who pay. I've not since I've come here, but previously I've asked to see, invoices for my legs, and you could buy a car for what some of our legs cost. I saw a foot ankle the other day that's would be like an SUV. And I know that a lot of companies, and I don't mean like Delatour is a company, but the companies that make the components, you'll see on, especially like in Facebook groups, somebody, for example, Rush Foot came out with a new foot that I want to try. And people are like, well, how much does this cost? And their response is, talk to your prosthetist. Because the contracted price, what UPMC may pay them for that foot, Aetna may not pay for that foot. Aetna may pay more or less, or however that goes. But you get into contracted prices, and that's why these companies, they don't want to say, hey, this foot's $30,000 or whatever. That's just, I don't know that it's that price. That's just a number I'm pulling out. And so I think I would like to see more of a transparency. And I mean, we could spend a month talking about the ACA, what probably is going to happen, what we don't want to happen, and what we would like to see happen. Because the biggest thing that, from my perspective, that I want to do is anything so that we can make it so that amputees can continue getting the prostheses that we need in order to live a meaningful life. If all the time for different causes people say, well, we're guaranteed the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, well, that would be hard for an amputee to do without having a prosthesis, whether, it's someone like me who's lower limb or whether it's someone who's upper limb, regardless of the level of amputation. We have a patient that I met who all of his limbs are gone. And if the ACA would change drastically enough, what would that individual do besides nothing?
Brian, you make it a really good point there to highlight the importance of educating yourself, having gone through this process. You pointed out the ACA. Can you elaborate that real quick for our audience that may want that as a resource to go to?
Well, the Affordable Care Act, I mean, that's, a lot of people want to call it Obamacare. Let's call it the ACA because that's what it is. It's the Affordable Care Act. And regardless of, we want it to be a partisan effort from our lawmakers to say, look, we recognize that people need health insurance, they need this coverage, and we're going to do what it takes to provide them with that coverage. The ACA has said that insurance companies can't look at you and say, oh, you're an amputee, well, we're not going to cover you, or whatever the case may be, diabetic, heart disease, cancer, whatever. So now, thanks to the ACA, you get that coverage. And I highly recommend, people need to be involved. If you have any kind of heart defect, health issue of any kind, whether you're an amputee or anything, people need to really get into the ACA, see what it's about, and I highly recommend people contact their representative to Congress, their senators. People say, well, they don't listen to me. Just keep bugging them because, we elect them, we put them there for better, for worse, and, they need to hear from us. This is what we need. This is what we expect. We don't want them going off and just doing their own thing because then we're going to replace them when they do. But,
sure.
And not to be political at all, but the thing is to make sure that we can continue so that people can get what they need. And that's really it. I think anyone should just get in and look up. Just go to Google. Just Google ACA, and people can read about the coverages that are available. And
and if I can piggyback a little bit off of that, is that prior to the ACA, and again, I'm not just trying to get into this as far as right, wrong, or good or bad, but people had caps with the insurance carriers that they had, and so we would get patients coming in that would need an entire prosthesis, and they had a $7,500 lifetime cap, which would basically cover nothing, hardly anything.
Yeah.
So then patients would call in, and we would actually, and our billing staff would even say, okay, you need to start looking for a plan that's going to cover prosthetics. But then the premiums were outrageous because they had pre-existing conditions. So there's good things that have happened with the changes, and there's been some things that have been challenging for the orthotic and prosthetic industry at large. But we pretty much overcome those and making sure that we justify what we do. And unfortunately, there's still the higher deductibles have become an issue for some folks. So I think no matter what you do, no matter how you slice it, there's always a trade-off when it comes to the insurance side of things. So we just, like Brian said, we just want to make sure that patients have the ability to have coverage that they can get what they need. Now that's not saying that everyone who comes in the door says, I want this high-end microprocessor foot ankle that's going to cost $60,000 or whatever. We've been able to do a few of those through workman's comp. Most insurance carriers will not cover those type of devices, but the manufacturers have become very much involved with it. So they're doing outcome studies. So they're proving the fact that some of these components are helping reduce shear forces, and they're helping reduce stress on the contralateral limb and knees, and it's just so once these studies are coming out, then insurance carriers are more likely to cover these because they can look long term and say, hey, this is saving us from doing total knees and backs and hips and things like that because of some of these newer components that are coming on the market now. So we're excited. We're not by any means being negative about it, because we think that things are going to continue to progress. We hope.
Yeah, and we could talk about that area for hours and hours and hours, and you guys have been so generous with your time. And Brian and Drew, I wanted to sort of wrap this up a little bit with allowing you the opportunity to sort of explain why you think Delatour has a actually I'm going to scratch that, because I think throughout this you've explained so well why Delatour has the Delatour difference, as you have talked about, Brian. But I wanted to ask sort of where you think the future of the company is going. And then, Brian, I'll leave it to you at the end if you want to give a plug for where people can find Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics on social media, Twitter, Facebook, all of that stuff.
Sure. As far as the future, I'm excited about the new technology. There's been a lot of changing going on in the last 10 years or more. I know there was a period of time when I was kind of getting a little bit burnt out in the field because things were pretty static, and then all of a sudden the technology took off, and microprocessor knees came into play, and microprocessor foot ankle systems came into play. And now we are actually in the process of getting a CAD/CAM system for our manufacturing side of things, looking at 3D printing as well. So things are skyrocketing in terms of the newer technologies out there, and basically once we adopt it, it's going to make us more efficient, which will in turn make our practitioners, they'll have more time to spend with the patient, because rather than standing back in the modifying room on a plaster mold model, we can now modify on screen, kick it over to a car, that type of stuff. So that's what we're in the process, and we're hoping within the next month or so we'll have that online and then running, and then the 3D printing hopefully will be coming next. So the technology is fantastic. We just have to get on board with it.
Incredible.
And make sure that we're there. So,
from my perspective of social media, when you look at the largest population of amputees, we'll just say in the United States, obviously we're not going to serve the entire United States, with our 8 offices in the Pittsburgh area, but we serve a lot of patients, 13,000 a year on average, Delatour services. But from a social media perspective and changing the way we do business, is that my goal is to educate everyone we can. Every day I'm in groups that I see people complaining either about the company they're with, their doctor or something, and they don't know what to do. And I want to educate people. And just because you're not in Western Pennsylvania doesn't mean you can't create your own team wherever you are. You can get a PM&R doctor, and you can get a prosthetist, and that is with a company, and you can talk to physical therapists and OTs and whatever you need, and bring all of that together. And so, my goal is to use social media to be able to bring that together to whether we're doing podcasting or whether it's on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever medium we can use to educate people. Not just about the Delatour brand and what we're doing, but about prosthetics in general and how people can get the things they need. And if people are interested in what we're doing here, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, it's at Delatour, PRS. is our handle on all of those. We also have a website, www.delatouronp.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. And we will put all of the information and links to that in our show notes. And Delatour is Delatorre. And Drew, Brian, thank you so much for taking the time today to sit down with us and share your story and experience, and allowing us to learn a lot more about Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics. So you've heard from Drew Buffett, the prosthetist, Brian Mosier, who's had experience in amputation, now a part of the Delatour company. Guys, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, or you want to learn more about Brian, Drew, and Ed, who was on earlier, Ed Delatour, the owner, check us out at twonobodies.com, TWOKNOWBODIES.com, on Twitter, and then on Twitter and Instagram at twonobodies, and on Facebook at the Nobodies Podcast. The Nobodies Podcast, that's right. That's it for us. Guys, it's your body. Know it.
You've been listening to Amp Life, the official podcast of Delatour Orthotics and Prosthetics, located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you've enjoyed today's episode, leave us a review on iTunes or give us a like on Facebook. I'm the Brian Moe. I invite you to visit our website, www.delatouronp.com, or check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Delatour PRS. Tune in next time for another episode of Amp Life.